to the podcast. We are continuing the conversation from last week on how to maintain a culture of consistency. And we've been looking at that conversation and that question in a few different lights. And so last week we began this 3 weeks of conversation with talking about how do you maintain and how do you keep this culture of consistency within your church from the standpoint of you being the youth pastor that is going to be leaving your church to go to go work at another ministry or to go to another occupation, however that might be. But with that, the other thing that we are looking at is the interim period. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at the, I said this in the last episode, it looks like for most people, it seems like the average interim time for most churches is anywhere from 6 months to 18 months, depending on the hiring and how prompt the church is to get that new person. And so sometimes this can take a long time and it can be a really, really drawn out endeavor. And so our conversation today is going to be, how do you maintain that church culture of consistency within your ministry when you're no longer there, but the new youth pastor hasn't stepped in yet either. And so we're going to talk about how you encourage volunteers, how do you give freedom to volunteers to do their own thing, yet run in the guidelines of the ministry. And then also, how do we bring this out to a whole church focus on how the entire church sees the youth as their ministry instead of just the one person that's hired on as the youth pastor. And so it's a lot of, I feel like with this episode, it's going to be a lot of vision casting. It's going to be a lot of answering the administrative and the technical questions. But with that, let's just start with the obvious question, like, what is the downfall of not paying attention to this interim period between youth pastors, and why is it such a critical moment for a church and the student ministry?
I think that, and we talked a little bit about this in the last episode, that not leaving well, leaving too quickly, not leaving quick enough, those things can certainly create a situation where the volunteers are completely unprepared and can ultimately hurt not just the youth ministry but other ministries as well, especially if you are in a position where you're in a dual role with children's ministry, youth ministry, worship ministry, media. There's always something more that falls than just the youth ministry, because it's that other duties as assigned kind of part of our role that can be really, really challenging. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that going into it, and even with some level of hurt, I think it's really, really important that the way that I shaped it with my family and as well as the staff at my old church is that at the end of the day, I think there's a responsibility with our relationship with God to understand that even if we are leaving because things are really, really bad and we're totally justified in leaving, I think we have to be careful not to kill our witness in the meantime. What I mean by that is sometimes, and justifiably so, we could get real fleshly with how we handle it to the point of going, you know what? You treated me this way, and I was really, really kind and I was really graceful while I was there, and now I'm going to burn Utica to the ground, to quote The Office. I think that's not an actual thing. But, I think sometimes we want to sort of go, oh, I'm not here, and so now I'm going to make sure that everything falls apart. I've seen it happen. That's why it's easy to joke about, but I have seen people leave their church and try to do damage on the way out and go, well, I'm not there anymore, so I don't have to deal with it. That is so, so dangerous. And the other side of it that I think we need to, again, consider is just because you've been hired at another church doesn't mean that can't damage your witness with the next church. They may go, whoa, hang on. And I've also seen this where a youth pastor decided they were going to hurt their current church, and their next church saw the way that they left, and they were like, no thank you. And now you're out of job, and you've burned the bridge, so you can't go back. And so now you're in a position where you are churchless, and who's going to be the church that gets the phone call when you interview at the next church? Your old church, and you just burned Utica to the ground. Like, I think it matters, and not just for you professionally, but we have to remember that no matter what the situation is, we are ambassadors for the kingdom of God. We are called to be children of God, and it's important to leave as kindly and graciously as possible. And so don't ruin things just because it might give you a momentary bit of revenge or something because you felt like people wronged you, if that makes sense.
Yes, I can definitely see some of those, like, well, because I'm not there and I'm not going to help the next person, they'll see how much they miss me, like that feeling, like, and so, that can feel so good every once in a while, but it is not good for your mental health. It is not good for the church you're leaving or the one you're going to, and it's not good for the kingdom of God. When we're thinking about volunteers, if we're not preparing that interim, that space in between for the next person, you can lose students, you can lose that momentum that you already had started, and then you can lose, this could be one of the really bad ones, you can lose your spot at camp, and it is so hard if you need to get into a new camp, that if maybe they don't have availability. And so you have to prepare your people to still go on. There's also that big thing about, this is about students, right? These are about students, and you maybe don't know, or you do know, that people have left in their life. And we want to be the people that are leaving them in a good way, not a bad way. They've already maybe been abandoned by a parent or a family member of some sort. And so we want to make sure that doesn't impact them. And I really do think it could cause some trauma if you leave in a really bad way to a kid who's already had lots of people leave in their life. And then they're not going to be able to trust the next person because everybody just leaves. And so I think that if we prepare where we've got those volunteers that stay, that they're consistent and they're already consistent, that they don't have as much of those feelings because, Harold and Cindy, they're going to be here, through this whole thing. They're not leaving me. And so I think that when we create that environment with our volunteers, that it can really help with that transition.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely something to think of. And I think a lot of times when we come into these situations, we feel like we know exactly what we're doing, but in a real sense, we have no idea what we're doing because we've never done it before. And so with this, one of the things to kind of take in, I think a lot of times with church culture and dealing with these different this like critical time, is you have to lean into people that have had those moments and had those experiences. And so with that, we have to have those mentors, have those people that we can look to. There have been books written on this topic. There have been tons of resources put out as well. And there's opportunities to do that. But I personally, at least in this regard, I think the best effort or the best way to do this is just to talk to people that have done it. And so you might hear horror stories where it was a tragic and terrible instance of stuff happening, or you might find the people that were super successful, and you see these great transition stories. But listening and hearing about other people in their opportunities and their responses through these is very, very important. So when we talk about trying to preserve the core culture of youth ministry, during this time window of the interim season, what exactly are we talking about? What is the core culture of youth ministry? I
think for us specifically is the routine. is keeping that same day until you get a new person and maybe they want to change things. I think that's different. But like in that interim is keeping the consistency of the routine because the kid knows when to show up, right? They know what we're going to be doing tonight. They know that, we're first going to, for us, we eat dinner first and then we do worship and then we do our, whatever activity we have that day. And so keeping that routine, kids thrive on routines. Like this is very much studied and is very much, goodness gracious, what's the word I'm looking for? Proven, very much proven that kids thrive on routines. And so keeping that during that interim time, because there's already going to be things that are different, right? It's not the same person leading the activity. And so that's already going to create, especially in the world we live in, anxiety. And so we want to lessen that anxiety as much by keeping some of those things the same. And so I would say just the routine of the days of the week that we meet and the way that we go about the day.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think ultimately we have to know at the core, like, why are we here in the first place? And so I made it very clear with our volunteers and our students. And one thing that I think the Methodist Church lends really, really well to is that we're very transparent about the way that we operate with everybody involved. Kids, youth ministry, like everybody understands, like, these are our policies and this is why we do it. This is the scope and sequence. This is why we do it. We like our methods and we're very open about them. And so I think that lends well for us. And so from our students through our volunteers, everybody knows who we are, what we're about, and why it matters. I think as long as that core is there, then it doesn't matter what you do because you keep the main thing. And so it's like, number one, this is a safe place for everybody. That can cover a whole gamut of things. It's a whole different episode. But something we've talked a lot about here on the podcast is, okay, let me finish. So the core meaning that it's a safe place, and number two, that Jesus is at the center of everything. If you do those things, it doesn't really matter what you plug in. I mean, there are things that are going to be effective and things that aren't going to be as effective. But if those, the main thing is the main thing, you're going to be okay. But I think the other thing that really helps is that we kind of going back to what we talked about in the last episode is, instead of doing everything for everyone all the time, having volunteers and student leaders, this is where that becomes key. If you have a strong student leadership team, when you leave, they're already leading. They already have experience. It's not like a situation where they go, okay, now he's gone, I got to get ready to step up. They've already been stepping up. They've already led certain things. And so this is why I think it's key to have a student-led worship team and a student-led media team and a student-led even preaching team. I always have 2 to 3 students that I tell them, hey, I want you to have 2 to 3 sermons in your back pocket at any given moment. Why? Because who knows when you're going to need it. I might get strep on a Wednesday morning and need someone to step in. Now, granted, we've got great leaders and volunteers that are very comfortable with that. And our pastor is very comfortable with that. He did 15 years in youth ministry, and he regularly, we did a series this last semester where we team preached. And so it was me and our pastor and all of our volunteers got to speak. And I told our students all the way through it, you're getting to see this opportunity. Pay close attention because you're going to be asked to do the same thing next semester. And so for those that would like to, I would love to give you an opportunity to speak. We have 4 that are ready to go for the spring. And so those are practical things that if I had to be gone for any reason, sick, impaled, as we talked about last time, in a car wreck or whatever, and I'm going to be out for several weeks.
That escalated quickly.
Well, she literally used the word impaled last time, so I'm literally just quoting. But
No, I did not say impaled. I said incapacitated.
Oh, I thought you said impaled.
No, incapacitated for whatever reason. Okay. You've been bitten by a snake.
Incapacitated. Our editing team will work on that. Just kidding. But he's like, no, I'm not. I'm leaving that in there. But you get the point. Have them practice now, not because you may leave, but because isn't that our job as student pastors, is to equip them to lead in their schools, in their workplaces and stuff like that. So when those situations do arise where you do get to a place where God calls you to somewhere else, they're not scared because they already feel confident.
Yeah, no, and I think going back, another thing that kind of looks into this is I think both of y'all grew up in youth groups. But one of the things with core culture of youth ministry that I look back to is going back to my youth group. And the thing is like in all reality, y'all mentioned this a second ago, but relationships was one of the core cultural values of youth. And so when I look back, like I look back into my youth ministry days and I'm like, I understand nothing, but it is one of those that like I do remember the relationship. I do remember that my youth pastor was there. I do remember the fact that he took time out of his schedule to be at things. He wrote letters to us at camp, all kinds of crazy stuff, which was super super cool, and it was something that like I really really cherished as a youth. And so having those opportunities and those moments for building relationships is really, really important. And I think that's a huge part of the core culture that we're talking about. And that can really be a difficult transition, because if your volunteers don't have those relationships built, they can't start when you leave, because you're going to lose all of the kids that you did have because you were the one that built the relationship and they didn't. And so those volunteers need to be very, very much in tune with trying to build relationships now. And that needs to be a core part of your system where volunteers are working on building relationships just as much as you are. So when you step out or when you're gone a week, like David said, if you're out for strep or being impaled
Impact.
or whatever, I mean, like if you have to be gone for any amount of time, or you're gone permanently and you're stepping out of that ministry, the volunteers have to have that ability to step in, and just continue on loving on students and keeping up with relationships and just pouring their heart into those kids. And I think that's one of the core values that will change, that will like stay if you really really work on it, and that'll keep kids there. Because if you have a system to where your volunteers are pouring into those lives of students and they want to have conversations with them, the teaching style might change when you step out. But if they are still there doing the relationship part, then the kids will be okay with that. Like I said, I remember like 4 5 youth ministry lessons from my youth pastor growing up, and they were all visuals that were just like captivating visually, that I remember the visual like a lot more than I remember the actual lesson attached to them. But it was one of those things, like I very much remember the aspect of my youth pastor coming out and building that relationship and being there.
One thing to your point there that I think really helped us in before I even transitioned out, is that the last 2 years I was there at my last church, we decided to implement a bit of a group going to everybody stuff. And so we had like a big calendar in our youth room that the students could write down all their events. And what we did was we had all of our volunteers, and we would bring as many parents as possible into our little group. And we were the uh, First Methodist and then Grace Fellowship. We changed our name, but we were the Grace Fellowship like cheering section. And so it became a thing that started growing. And so it started with just me and two of my volunteers, and then we started getting parents, and like it got to a point where I remember the last basketball game we went to, we took up an entire section. It was like almost our whole church, because we told the whole church like, hey, this is our last basketball game, let's show up. And there was like a bunch of us there, and we took up a whole section. We all wore our church shirts, and it was a really cool special thing, because that student was like, dude, my whole church showed up. Like, that's huge. And obviously it wasn't the whole church, but it was a good enough section that they felt really loved and cared for in that situation. And so in that deal, it's something that they still do. They've kept up, and I don't have to be there. And so it's kind of a beautiful thing that it's sort of, grown arms and legs and became a whole system, which is really, really cool. And so those students still feel loved, because they've got their church cheering section. It's simple, but it's a practical way to get your volunteers to kind of step into the very things that you're doing on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I think it's one of those. And I take a second just to stop for a second. Eh, if you're not in a transition period, or if you're not in a situation where you feel like you have to leave, um, be sure that you're cherishing what you have. Um, I like be sure that you're actually in the moment, and actually enjoying what you're doing, because I think a lot of times, especially with youth ministry, we get so like down in the trenches doing our job that we don't get to actually stop and enjoy the fact that we get to do what we do. And I mean, not to throw too many office quotes out here, but it's like just the mindset of like, I wish there was a way to know that you're in the good old days before you left them. Like a lot of times we
Someone
look
should write a
back at
song
youth.
about that.
A lot of times a lot of times we go into these moments and like we don't realize how like the great things about ministries that we left because we're so focused on what has to be done or the negatives of ministry. And so like if you're not in that, like be sure that you're thinking regularly of the things that are going well. Because a lot of times I think, like I said, we get so caught up in the hustle and bustle of everything else that when we get into these moments of leaving and prepping for transition and stuff like that, like we have these moments to where it's like all we see is the work or all we see is the negatives, and it's like, man, there were some great things about my time here. And I think a lot of times we lose sight of those in the efforts of like working and doing everything else. um
To Brent's point, write it down, please. Have a journal. This is
mhm,
my what I call my celebration journal. I'm not allowed to write negative things in this. I can only write positive things. I can only talk about the things that are good. Why? Because sometimes you need just a place to see all the good, and so
yeah,
it definitely helps you appreciate those things just a little bit more. And so this
yeah.
is my little celebration journal, and I
And
take it
keep a
everywhere with me.
box of every letter that a student ever writes you.
Oh, 100%. I have all of
um
them, and
yeah,
most of them are on my fridge, but I also have a box with all
yeah,
the other things.
yeah. So kind of moving back into the core culture thing, I think optimism and like seeing the good is a huge part of that, like celebrating wins and doing all these things. And I think that's something that also you have to teach your volunteers, because if you don't teach your volunteers how to celebrate wins and they move into this transition period and they just see it as work and negativity of like, oh my gosh, I have to go do this again, and they're not celebrating and looking for these different wins that are going on, burnout's going to happen fast, just like it would with us. Like most of the time within youth ministry, we are told that at some point, of this mindset of like, hey, you have to be looking for the wins. You have to be looking for these moments of discipleship or these moments of evangelism, these moments of relationship building where like kids are making steps towards whatever they're needing to do, whether that be accepting Jesus or coming to youth 3 times straight, because they're starting to see this as like a need. Like celebrating those things is super super important. Anytime a student comes on a Wednesday night, that should be a celebration because they have 1,000 things that they could be doing instead. And I one of the comments that we had last year that blew me away, I had a parent tell us, and I've mentioned this in a couple of podcasts, I had a parent come like celebrating with us because their parent their kid was like, yeah, I'm not going to go to baseball practice on Wednesdays this year. I'd rather be at youth. And it was like, whoa, that's cool. Like, so
Well, and
celebrate those things.
yeah, and those little disruptors too. Like, I had a student who did the same thing for cheerleading, and cheerleading is a big deal in my old town. And to say she wasn't going to go to practice on Wednesday for church, And then she even told all the other students, they're like, I'm not going to be there, and neither should you. And it took like several weeks of her doing that, but they ended up finally deciding that they were going to cancel Wednesday night practices. So it can be done if a student is willing to lead, but they have to be willing
I love
to
that.
push against the grain.
Yeah, no, and that's a big, it's a big deal. I think it's something that like, and I bring this up with like specific conversation to this episode, and it's not like something we should have talked about last episode, because like I said, if you're not celebrating those wins now, and you're not teaching your volunteers to celebrate those, when it comes to this time, they're not going to. They're not going to see those wins. They're going to notice things happen, but having that ability to classify them as wins or classify them as positive things in ministry, like that has to be taught. So very, very much like you have to be modeling what you want to transition now. So if you're only modeling the work and the negativity and talking about your busyness, guess what? When they get into that role, they're going to start modeling your work, modeling your complaining, and modeling your busyness. And so please, please, please model well, model the things that you want them to do, especially if you're looking towards this transition period. Um, and so I feel like that might be a question for the next one. So how can, and this kind of leads into the whole church leadership dynamic of what we were talking about earlier. How can church leadership empower volunteers to lead well during a pastoral vacancy? So like youth pastors already stepped out, how does the church come in to handle and empower these volunteers to keep on keeping on?
I think the biggest thing is the admin side of it. That you have to give your volunteers the information that they need to make youth happen, whether that is phone numbers, whether it is the access to the email, whether it is the access to like your social medias or your website. They have to be able to keep doing those things that you are doing to get kids to come to youth, right? And then there's the other big thing of they have to be able to figure out how to buy things. We're all individually assigned and given credit cards or whatever, however you do finances at your church. But like, I know I have to turn my card in when I leave, right? And they can't just pass that on to someone else because it's got my name on it. And so, how are they going to buy dinner? How are they going to take the kids to the water park? How are they going to pay for camp? Like they need to be able to have the ability, whether that is, well, when you need something, then you have to go to this certain person who already has a card, but they need to know what to do, or they need to be given the access to the things. And so I think those would be the biggest things that I could think of. If I was just gone tomorrow, there would be several things that my people would not be able to do. One of them would just be access the building, like getting into it and getting into the office over there where all the like the keys to the vans are, like things like that. And so I'm not sure that you need to have like a go bag is what's in my brain, but like a go message. Like these are the things that if Melissa died tomorrow, these are things that need to be done. But you do need to have some kind of plan, and your volunteers that with going with your board or with your admin, whoever is handling those things, they have to be given some authority to be able to handle those things.
Yeah, no, definitely. David, do you have anything to add?
Oh, I think she said it perfectly.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely, I mean, it's one of those things like, one of the things that during the transition period that I think did go well, when I left my last church, and this is a huge shout out to my pastor, that was there at the time. He actually set up weekly meetings with the volunteers that were leading the program. And so he was in, not necessarily in the trenches because he led something on Wednesday nights, but he was very, very engaged and actively thinking it through what they were doing. And when it comes to that mindset, like the pastor's buy-in is crucial. And so having a pastor that's saying, hey, like, I understand that you're, I mean, let's be honest, you're taking this on pro bono and we're not paying you. And you were just volunteering and being told what to do. Now you're doing the job and not getting paid for it. Like there's a lot of weight that comes to that. And so with that, I think it's one of those like conversations that like the pastor needs to be engaged. If the pastor's not stepping in and being regularly available for these volunteers, much like the pastor should be for a youth pastor or other minister on staff, like it's something that's gonna not do well, because there needs to be some kind of accountability, but also there needs to be some kind of encouragement and refreshment for these leaders that are pouring in and not getting anything in return. And so having the buy-in from pastoral staff, especially your senior pastor, is a huge deal to add to this. Um, and so with that, when we talked about how church leadership empowers volunteers, um, how can we navigate the mindset of student and parent engagement though? How do we work on the church caring for and communicating well with students and families? Because obviously this is a time frame where communication might not be as evident. Maybe you as a youth pastor are a great communicator, maybe you're not. If you aren't, that's something you should start doing. But how can the church step in and kind of fill that gap and fill that void of communication when the students and families are dealing with this transition period?
I think having a good system of communication is important. I think well, most youth ministries have some way that they send messages out or give reminders for different things. I know several youth groups, including ours, uses GroupMe as just a way to have that consistent communication. And I've told all of our leaders and our student leaders, hey, if it dawns on you, um, please continue to communicate things. Like I have one volunteer who is over making sure that we have meals for our Sunday night youth. And so she's really good at getting in GroupMe and saying, hey, I've noticed we got a week where we don't have anybody volunteered for a meal. Do you mind stepping in? And it seems really small, but it's really important, because then that's one less thing that I have to think about. Because I'll be honest, food is not something I am gifted in, as far as cooking or doing things like that, and sort of the hospitality side of that. And so she's able to use her gift in a really practical way. And she was like, hey, I am happy to lead that, and you don't have to think about it, which I'm like, that's fantastic. And so little things like that. And so she'll get in there and she'll say, hey, just a reminder, we're gonna eat this meal on Sunday. So if anybody has any allergies, let us know so we can make sure you have something different. But that communication's in there, and it's not just me doing all the communication. So again, they're prepared right away to step into that, which is nice.
I would say also same thing, but making sure that all of that information is updated. If you use a database program, for example, for all your attendance and your church directory, things like that, my youth, I swear they change their phone numbers like every month. And so there is listed in my phone, like blank's name this year, like even sometimes just spring of 2025, and then it'll be like summer of 2025. So I've got them all listed on my phone. But I know that probably this week I need to go update those things in Realm, is what we use. So if I did leave, that our volunteers and even the admin downstairs would have access to the current information for them. If they've moved, if they've changed schools, all of those things need to be updated pretty regularly. And so you have to think about it. If I wasn't here, or for example, if I lost my phone, we are in a world of hurt, y'all. Like, I can't contact anybody. um, and so be thinking about, what happens then? Like, what can I do to prepare for that happening? Not that I want to lose my phone, but just in case. So updating
Yeah.
information.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a million reasons not to do something, but the thing is like this shows that the church has buy-in. This shows that the church has an opportunity to step in and be that support structure. And like I said, it all comes back to supporting those volunteers that are doing what you used to be doing, or whether that be teaching, or whether that be just running through a curriculum, or whether that just be keeping the youth group going with trips and stuff like that. I mean, all of those things are super, super important. But I think that this is one of those questions that we might not be able to fully answer, but this might be just kind of some ideas. What are some ways to keep students engaged in their faith when there's no official youth pastor?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Obviously, there's a fair amount of nuance that comes with, you know, thinking about that. But I think again, as youth pastors, it's our job to equip our students to be able to have a faith that is totally their own, not their parents, not ours, not our senior pastors, nobody else's but theirs. And so, if we are doing our job effectively, then it should not matter whether we are in charge or somebody else is in charge or volunteers in charge or nobody's in charge. That our students' faith should be, in that perfect world where our students are taking their faith seriously. And so I think it's important for us to make sure that you have a good dynamic in play. And truthfully, one of the best I know of for giving students that practical faith is actually something that Brent has talked about that he does with his youth group, which I'll kind of set it up and let you talk about it. But he has a system in place for his youth ministry that, depending on what grade level they're in, is going to be the curriculum for that year. So, like, he has a very specific curriculum for his sixth graders to get the foundation that they need to then be able to go a little bit deeper as a seventh grader, eighth grader, high school, or stuff like that. So, if you don't mind kind of walking, I think you've done it before in a previous podcast. I think it really, I think the way that you've set it up is a beautiful way that I think a lot of churches need to implement.
I would say the structure of it is probably more important than the actual curriculum that you use, but it's just the mindset of, if you, I mean, it'd be like you walking into a junior high in the sixth grade learning the same thing as the eighth grade. It just doesn't make sense. Like, you wouldn't have a sixth grader and a senior sitting in the same classes. And so just the mindset of, like, if you don't have a maturation spectrum of your ministry to where the sixth grade is learning something more basic, and then the seventh and eighth grade grow on that, and then freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, it grows on that, and they are constantly moving forward in a spiritual maturation. Like, you're doing a disservice to your kids. If your youth group isn't growing um, in what they know and how to apply it, then that needs to be something that's done. And so, being able to, granted, this requires small groups, this requires small group leaders, but having that opportunity to where you can have different mindsets and different foundational things for each grade to listen or learn from, is incredibly important. Because if you're doing the same lesson for everybody, you're leaving the ones that are way past it, and you might be overthinking or over speaking to the ones that haven't heard it yet. And so you can't do a one size fits all lesson in youth groups and be super effective. They have to have some dynamic of whether, and I've seen a lot of different adaptations of this. Sometimes I've seen youth pastors do a lesson and then have the small group conversations break and do different things, because that can be valuable. And so, like, maybe the sixth grade questions don't go as deep as the high school questions. Maybe the high school questions skip the more watered down substance, and go deep into the personal application questions of, like, how do I make this real in my life? How do I take this into the high school next week, etc. And so I'm not saying that there's no validity in, like, having the one message. Don't get me wrong, but I think if you're doing that and not preparing the soil for different ages, you're really hurting your chances of it being impactful and sticking. Or you're just going to do the same sermon over and over and over, and people are going to be like, oh yeah, I've heard that one before. And so having those moments, having those opportunities for the soil to be at different levels, and for you to have different expectations for different grades is really, really important. And that is something that can be really, really difficult in transitions. So if you don't have a volunteer buy-in, or you have one or two volunteers that are coming into this situation, and they're like, well, we don't have the time or the effort to do this. It's like obviously you have to fit what you can do, but like ultimately hopefully there's some way, whether you're having junior high and senior high meet separately and you have two different lessons or something to that nature, to where you are speaking to the group that you have, not speaking to the whole group and hoping it sticks. And so just different mindsets behind that idea of preparation.
So I like that, because if you're looking at your like volunteers handling things because someone is leaving, then they know exactly, what the sixth graders should be learning about now and what the seventh graders should be learning about that now. Now, that works really well if you have a big enough group. If you only have one sixth grader and you have two seventh graders and then you have like five eighth graders, that's going to be more difficult. So you can't, especially in Methodist Church, we don't do one-on-one really well, save sanctuary, but I do like the idea of having the different levels of the questions. Like that makes more sense to me, because you're having you can't do, especially if you've only got an hour for youth, that you're going to go do a sixth grade lesson for these like two kids, and then at seventh grade, like you just don't have enough time. So I like the idea of taking that same lesson that you're
Definitely.
doing and having those different questions for those different levels. Because you're right, if you geared it directly towards those sixth graders, and then your freshmen who lives with me has heard that 12 times or 3 times, then they're not going to be able to grow in their faith. So you got to give them a little bit more. But sometimes you got to also deal with who you got. So,
Yeah, no, totally agree. I mean, and the thing is like you said, you have to do what you have. There's a goal that you can work towards, but at the same time, there's no harm in having a junior high lesson. So please don't take me wrong when I say that if you're listening to this. And there's no wrong with having a high school lesson, but I do think having those moments to where you can be deeper with different grades, or deeper with maybe not even necessarily grades, deeper with different kids with different spiritual maturation. Because I have some junior high students that are way more spiritually mature than some high school students, and I have some high school students that are way more mature than anybody else in the rest of our church. So like it's one of those things that like it grade is a hard thing to do, and so like navigating by grade level is a little different. It's hard, but just like schools have scope and sequence, like it's important to have this idea of a roadmap of what you're trying to teach. And
mm-hmm.
so like if you know what you're going to teach ahead of time and you know the direction that you're going, it's easier to branch off and provide those different questions and those different prompts that spark them to have different responses due to their different maturations.
I like that. Well, and especially what you're talking about, the not necessarily grades, because you can have a sophomore that's their first time at church ever. And so they're going to be, not have as much knowledge as the rest of their sophomore buddies. And you don't want them to feel left out. You don't want them to feel like they're stupid, because they haven't been here and they haven't had the opportunity to listen. And so I like that idea too, of just having those different levels of, you know, these are the things that we're learning. I mean, the same thing if you put a sophomore who's been homeschooling and maybe they didn't do well in math when they were homeschooling, and all of a sudden they're in geometry. Like that's
Yeah.
going to be difficult. So it's the same concepts there.
Yeah. And so as we're kind of transitioning and closing this conversation up, one more question for y'all, or maybe two more. If you could say one thing to the interim leadership team of a church that was like in the trenches doing it right now, what would you say?
I would personally say don't give up. Um, Using specifically Ephesians, no, Galatians chapter 6, you will reap a harvest if you do not give up. I think that is something we have to constantly remind ourselves as leaders of any kind of, really any juncture, but especially in ministry, is that it's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging. You may not necessarily feel called specifically, to do this for a long time. And that interim process can be so challenging because, unfortunately, in those times, there's not a definitive start and end date. It's whenever God allows us to have whatever comes next. And even then, I may not be able to just go, okay, you're here, bye. I may need to stick around for a few months and really just kind of make sure that everything goes as smoothly as possible. And that can be really, really challenging when you add that to the fact that many are dealing with personal struggles, and you throw that wrench in there too, and sometimes you can feel a little dumped on. And so I think it's important to remember, like, don't give up, that God has put you in this position because he trusts you. And so, that little bit of encouragement can make a huge difference. And then, you know, I think also, if you have, kind of similar to what Brent was saying earlier about like knowing you have it good. If somebody trusts you enough to give you the opportunity to talk about that, like they're in the trenches and they're talking to you about that, then that is a great opportunity for you to encourage that person through that season. It may be a situation where every couple of weeks or so, I probably need to shoot a quick text or a phone call and just say, "Hey, how's things going? Is there anything I can do to help?" Because, you know, in my current position, I'm doing pretty well. And if somebody called me and said, "Hey, I'm struggling," I could be a resource for that person to kind of help them through that. Or, hey, let's kind of talk about lesson plans for this week. And just being that that friend to help them through that might make all the difference in keeping them there.
My biggest thing, and I swear I say this every week, but grace, um, for those volunteers to give themselves grace, especially when you may have taken over from a full-time employee that this was all they did, and now you're doing it as a volunteer while also your full-time job and your family and your other activities. And so you're not going to be like, it's just impossible to do it exactly the same way that that other person was doing. There's just not enough time in the day. And so to realize that, and but that it's okay that it's not the same. Like, you still want to have maybe those routines and that consistency, but to give yourself some grace if it doesn't work. That it's not the end of the world if something doesn't happen. So not to get too down on yourself, not to give up, but just having that grace.
Well, I'm going to continue on that. And mine would be the same advice I'd give to any youth pastor that was listening. Newsflash, you are not special. Don't allow pride in your abilities. Don't allow pride in your successes to make you think you're bigger than you are. At the end of the day, it is a privilege that God is using you to make things happen. And it is a privilege to walk with God in this process. Don't think you're the big man on campus. Don't think that you are the person that's holding this thing together, because at the end of the day, there will be another youth pastor after you. There will be another volunteer after you. You have the privilege to be in this position. You have the privilege to see God working in the lives of students and God working in the lives of parents and volunteers around you. Don't take that for granted. Or don't allow that to be something that builds up pride in you to where you think you're the star of the show and forget to point people to the real star of the show, because Jesus is that star, not us. And so, like, I say that with as much grace as I can, but like, nip that in the bud as soon as it comes in, because it is a privilege that you get to do what you do, whether you get paid for it or not. It is an honor and a privilege to get to walk alongside students as they learn who Jesus is. So, like, don't make it about you, make it about Jesus. You are not the person, so don't try to be the person. And so with that, I guess the last what maybe just a phrase or two. What does success look like in an interim season? Not just surviving it, but stewarding that season well. And we'll close with this question.
I'd say a student grows deeper in their relationship with Jesus. Anytime that can happen, it's a win. Whether that's you or an interim or somebody else, when a student grows closer to God, and ultimately, our dream at the end of the day, my why is that you grow in a relationship and you take that relationship with God so seriously that your kids, when you are, an adult and married and have kids of your own who are now at the age of youth, they get to experience the same Jesus and the same church and the same experiences that you got to experience. So if we're doing our job effectively, we're talking about multiple generations. And so as long as we, again, keep the main thing, and that these students get to experience and encounter Jesus, you're winning. Whether that's 2 students or 200 students, you're winning.
And mine goes right along with that, for kids feeling included, that they don't feel left behind or just abandoned. Like that they are all. I was gonna say, like, you keep the kids that you have, like, but I mostly it's a deeper feeling than that. I just want them to feel that they are, like, this is their church. This is where they belong. So kids included.
Yeah, no, and I definitely agree with that. And my last quote, or my last thought, I guess, would be just understanding why you are the way that you are. Because when we look at this, like, you have to understand from the kid's perspective or the student perspective, like, ultimately understanding that their identity is found in Christ is the paramount point. However God utilizes them, however God gifts them, how they can use that gifting. And it kind of goes to what David said with the whole steps, like making steps towards that process. But ultimately, like, all of our goal in this is to find our identity in Christ. Because when we find our identity in Christ, we find out how God can utilize our skill sets and our abilities to glorify Him through kingdom work. And so, whether you're the leader listening to this, like, what is your identity? What is God trying to get you to do in this moment? And how can you use who you are to glorify God in that process? And so, understanding this mindset of like, we all have different skill sets, we all have different personalities and everything else. Utilize what you have, and let God fill in the rest. Because, like I said, it is a privilege to get to do this. It is an opportunity, and don't take it for granted, but allow God to teach you things about yourself in the process too. If there's anything about ministry, I think that has been eye-opening to me, it's how God can use all of my things that I find inefficient, or all my things that I find not good about myself, that God's like, dude, you need to get your eyes off yourself and just look at me. And so that mindset and that grasp and grip of understanding that we are made in God's image, so allow God to use us for that, is super, super important. But with that being said, that is all the time we have for this episode. Another long one, but I think these conversations have been really, really good. And so we would love to hear your thoughts on these as well. If you have any comments or anything like that, you can shoot us comments on social media. You can comment on most of the podcast programs, leave us comments on YouTube. We would love to hear what you know, or hear your experiences in these situations, especially if yours differ from ours. But the goal is like, we want this to be a conversation, and we want you to be a part of that too. So share this episode with youth pastor friends, share it on social media, leave us comments, send us an email, podcast@studentministryconversations.org. We'd love to hear from you. And until next week, we hope you have a great week and you keep on serving the students that you've been entrusted with. Have a great week.